Welcome back. We're deep in coffee now, and this episode gets weirdly practical fast. We are talking taste, caffeine, sleep, grinders, pods, and why your morning ritual might be lying to you. I love how he starts with, coffee is not punishment anymore. Because honestly, for years, people acted like coffee was just burnt regret in a cup. That shift matters because once you think coffee can taste good, everything changes. But let's be honest, most people still buy bitterness and call it personality. That is such a brutal way to say it, but it's true. The really interesting part is that coffee gets made 3 times. Farm, roast, brew, and you can ruin it at any step. Which is annoying because people act like the machine is the whole story. The machine is where everyone goes to spend money and feel superior. Exactly. And then the grinder quietly matters more than everything. That part always destroys people because they want the shiny espresso machine. He basically said a good grinder plus a cheap brewer beats a bad grinder plus a luxury machine, which is offensive to the entire internet coffee aesthetics community. People want the countertop spaceship, not the boring tool that actually helps. And he is so ruthless about it too. Just put beans in a grinder and stop dreaming. The funny thing is that advice is almost anti-luxury and still sounds premium, because it is about quality, not theater. Also, the tasting part was great because he actually heard the coffee before he judged it. Smelling 5 cups and instantly going, this one is burnt, this one has personality, that's very him. And the way he described McDonald's coffee was so precise without being dramatic. Not petrol station coffee, just deeply unexciting. That's the nicest insult possible. But the price thing is what got me, because the independent wasn't wildly more expensive. It was basically in the same range as the chains, sometimes cheaper than you'd expect. Yet people still assume the chain is the benchmark for what coffee should cost. That's so backwards when the chain has the giant supply chain and the tiny margins on emotion. Tiny margins on emotion is insane, but yes, exactly. The independent wins on character, but the chain wins on certainty. And that certainty is actually what makes the chain so powerful. You know exactly where to stand, who takes your order, and what disaster you will receive. The coffee might be average, but the social choreography is flawless. That's why independents scare people when they're traveling. You do not know if the place is great or weird or both. In a new city, people want coffee without a gamble. But the trade-off is that the better cup is often hiding in the risky place. The taste test itself proved the gap was smaller between the big chains than between chain and independent. Which is awkward for people who treat chain loyalty like a personality trait. Imagine your entire identity being Starbucks and then getting politely outperformed by Pret. That is a rough morning for branding. What I also liked was his point that acidity gets unfairly hated. People hear sour and think broken, when sometimes it's just better beans. But I get why regular drinkers recoil because most sour coffee tastes accidental. Like nobody wants their coffee to taste like it had a bad day. Still, that conversation about roast level was useful because people confuse dark with premium. The darker roast thing used to be a status signal, and now lighter roasts get treated like higher quality. Coffee really does have fashion cycles, which is ridiculous and kind of perfect. And then he moved into the bigger point, which is convenience always costs you something. That pot analogy as a microwave meal was savage but fair. It is the most polite demolition of capsule coffee I've heard. He wasn't saying people are stupid for using pods, just that they're paying for speed. And with pods, you're also paying in waste and usually in quality, which is the part people ignore because the button feels magical. The button is doing all the emotional labor. But here's the tension, because people genuinely need convenience. If your life is chaotic, a little acceptable coffee beats a perfect ritual you never do. That is where his take gets smart, because he is not anti-modern life. He's just saying don't pretend convenience has no downside. Then the whole caffeine conversation gets even more interesting because he almost downplayed addiction. He was basically saying most people are dependent, not addicted. And that's a very different claim than the one people usually make about coffee. Dependency feels milder, but maybe more honest. Because withdrawal is real, but people still act like it's just a harmless personality quirk. Meanwhile, the whole world is walking around under-caffeinated and angry. And the biggest harm he kept coming back to was sleep disruption. That is the actual tax, not just the cup itself. People think coffee steals a little alertness, but it can borrow from tomorrow. That's the line that should scare everyone who drinks late afternoon coffee like a hobby. The 4 p.m. coffee is not free, it is debt with foam on top. That's actually beautiful and depressing. And yet he still wasn't anti-coffee at all because he brought up the possible health upsides. Cognition, longevity, liver health, gut health, all the stuff people now keep discovering. Though with health claims, everybody suddenly becomes very selective about evidence. If a study says coffee is good, suddenly the internet becomes a lab. But it does make coffee feel less like a vice and more like a complicated habit with benefits. Which is probably the real theme of the whole conversation. Enjoy it, but don't be stupid about timing, quality, or the story you're telling yourself. That might be the cleanest coffee advice ever. And the wild part is he links all of that to climate and fairness, too. Less great coffee in the future, more pressure on growers, and more reason to pay properly. So your morning cup is also an agricultural and ethical decision, which is a little rude. Coffee always sneaks in with a whole philosophy degree. And I think that's why his audience keeps growing, because he makes the details feel alive. He starts with taste, and somehow ends up talking about supply chains and sleep. That's a very coffee way to teach people anything. Before we wrap, the home setup thing is the most relatable part of all this. Everyone wants the miracle machine, but he keeps dragging you back to the grinder. A very expensive dream gets defeated by a very boring cylinder. And honestly, that's useful life advice outside coffee, too. Pay for the boring thing that improves everything, not the flashy thing that photographs well. Brutal, but yes. All right, that's the coffee rabbit hole for this one. Next episode, we get into the bigger question of how he thinks about building trust, audience, and the future of coffee. And that one gets even more interesting because the coffee stops being just coffee. Welcome back, because this is where coffee stops being cute and starts exposing our bad habits. He basically says the biggest myth is that coffee is just one bitter thing with caffeine attached. Which is rude because that is exactly how a lot of people live with it. And the wild part is he makes it sound like the real enemy is not coffee, it is sleep damage. That is such an annoying answer because it is probably the correct one. Exactly. Nobody wants a wisdom answer when they came for a vending machine validation. I liked how he separated addiction from dependence because that distinction matters. He is basically saying most people are not romantically addicted. They are functionally trapped. Which is a lot less poetic but way more accurate. Right. And that is why cutting off caffeine early feels almost offensive at first. Because people hear noon and act like you have insulted their bloodline. But he keeps coming back to the same thing, which is that coffee can be great if it does not wreck tomorrow. That is actually a pretty grown-up way to use any stimulant. What do you think of the whole decaf point, though? Because for years, decaf felt like a sad apology to me. It was the coffee equivalent of ordering a fake ID and a salad. But his argument is not anti-decaf, it is anti-self-sabotage. If the ritual matters and the taste matters, why not keep the ritual and drop the sleep tax? That hits uncomfortably close to home, because a lot of us are defending bad sleep with good branding. Bro, coffee is carrying entire personalities. And then the tasting segment gets interesting because he is basically sniffing for roast level before he even sips. That part is so revealing, because most people think they are tasting quality when they are mostly tasting roast. Which is why darker always feeling better is such a sneaky scam. Our brains love when expensive-looking things taste aggressive. Yeah, oilier beans just look like they have a better LinkedIn profile. But the acidity thing is where people really get exposed, because they confuse bright with bad. And he is saying higher-grown coffee often has more acidity and more character, which is not a defect. It is just that a lot of us were trained by chain coffee to worship burnt familiarity. Burnt familiarity is a brutal phrase, but yes. The blind tasting was fun because it broke the brand spell pretty fast. McDonald's came off exactly like cheap commercial coffee, and he called it with zero ceremony. Which is how you know somebody has tasted enough coffee to stop being polite. But then the independent shop actually had more personality, which is the whole argument in one sip. Better raw material, more character, higher confidence, and still not wildly more expensive. That price part is annoying, because people assume chains set the market for everyone. He is basically saying that is a lie built by scale, not by quality. And the funniest bit is how often people think paying Starbucks money means paying for the best coffee. No, sometimes you are paying for the certainty of standing in the right line. That is so true because chains are really a logistics product pretending to be a cafe. He even made the travel point, which I think is the real reason chains survive so well. When you are lost in a new city, you do not want a coffee adventure, you want a functioning system. Exactly. You want your caffeine to behave like infrastructure. Coffee as public utility is such a funny idea, but also kind of true. Then he nukes the home espresso dream a little bit, which I respect because it saves people money. He is saying if you want really good espresso at home, you are signing up for a hobby. And most people do not want a hobby at 7 a.m., they want a beverage. Right, nobody wants to calibrate a shrine before breakfast. That is why the grinder obsession makes sense, because it is the boring thing that changes everything. I love that he said a cheap grinder with a fancy machine still makes bad coffee. It is a very expensive way to make disappointment more consistent. That sentence should be on the box of every bad appliance. But it is also a really clean example of where precision matters more than aesthetics. And then the pour-over option comes in like the most unsexy hero imaginable. A cone and hot water just walked in and beat half the market. The pod machine part was probably the most predictable indictment, but still fair. Convenience almost always hides a trade-off, and with pods it is usually quality, value, and waste. The microwave meal comparison is so perfect because nobody mistakes it for craft. You eat it because you are desperate, not because it has narrative depth. And that is kind of the entire convenience economy, isn't it? You pay extra to avoid friction, then act surprised when the result feels thinner. Human beings will spend more to do less, then complain about the output. That is basically civilization in one sentence. What also landed for me was the history, because coffee was never just a drink. The idea that London was running on weak beer before coffee feels insane now. Imagine replacing your whole civic mood with a stimulant and acting shocked by productivity. And those coffee houses becoming places for business, politics, and writing is massive. It makes coffee feel like an early social network, honestly. Except with more tables and fewer comments from strangers with no profile picture. That is actually a great way to put it. The whole thing also ties back to his bigger point about value, because he wants people to respect coffee enough to pay for it. Not because it is luxury for luxury's sake, but because the supply chain is fragile. Climate change means less land for high-quality coffee, so cheap and great coffee are not guaranteed forever. That part gets heavy fast, because it turns a morning habit into an economic reality. And I think that is why he keeps pushing mindful consumption instead of blind consumption. He is not trying to make coffee sacred, he is trying to make it intentional. Which is funny, because the most powerful coffee advice was basically, buy less stupid stuff. But that advice is dangerous, because now every expensive gadget looks like a lie with a power button. Brutal, but yes. Also, his audience strategy is interesting because it is not really about coffee gear. It is about trust, then using that trust to pull people deeper into the subject. That feels bigger than coffee, because any niche turns into a relationship eventually. If people trust you with one useful answer, they will eventually listen to a harder one. And maybe that is the real lesson of this episode, honestly. The best product is not the flashiest one, it is the one that respects your time and attention. Which is exactly what coffee pretends to do, and then sometimes absolutely fails at. Alright, that is the caffeine trap, the grinder truth, and the convenience tax. Next episode gets even bigger, because we get into trust, audience, and how coffee becomes a whole worldview. And that is where this stops being a drink conversation and starts becoming a life conversation. Welcome back, because this episode is basically coffee, caffeine, sleep, and the whole dependency illusion. And somehow it turns into grinders, pods, and why convenience keeps lying to us. That is such a coffee thing, by the way, to start with flavor and end with existential dread. I love that he says most people are dependent on caffeine more than addicted. Because that is a very polite way of saying, we built a legal drug routine. Bro, we defend it like it is a personality trait. But his point about sleep is the real dagger, because that is where the bill comes due. Not the buzz, not the habit, just the fact that your sleep gets quietly wrecked. And then the next morning you drink more coffee to fix the damage. Which is elegant in the worst possible way. The taste test part was so good, though, because it exposed how much of coffee is branding theater. McDonald's getting called basically vending machine coffee was brutal. And then the price was $1.30, which is honestly the most McDonald's thing ever. But the deeper point is that cheap does not automatically mean dishonest. It just means you are often paying for consistency, not depth. And sometimes you are paying for a logo and a queue system that looks emotionally safe. Emotionally safe coffee is such a funny phrase, but it is true. The independent shop winning the taste test was the least surprising part, and the most important one. Because it had actual character, and character is what chains flatten out. Even the price difference was weirdly small, which makes the chain dominance feel like a habit tax. That is why his defense of independence hit so hard. He is basically saying, if you care, you can taste the care. But then he also admits travel logic wins, because chains remove risk. Which is fair, because nobody wants a mysterious espresso adventure before a flight. You do not need your morning coffee to become a trust fall. The machine conversation got even better, because he basically said the grinder matters more than the machine. That is such an annoying truth if you want a fancy countertop toy. Everyone wants to buy the sexy machine, and he is like, no, buy the thing that crushes beans properly. And that actually makes sense, because if the grind is bad, the whole brew is already compromised. Tiny particles, big rocks, uneven extraction, bitter here, sour there, disaster everywhere. The coffee equivalent of bad project management. It is painful because it is so unglamorous. But it also means a good grinder is the biggest leverage point for normal people. That part felt almost democratizing. Like quality is not only for people buying a 4,000-pound setup. It is more like, get the boring thing right and you are already halfway there. Which is weirdly motivating because it means coffee excellence is less about flexing and more about discipline. Then the pod conversation was the cleanest convenience versus quality trade-off in the whole episode. He called it a microwave meal, which is honestly devastating. A microwave meal with a better brand font. But it is a fair comparison because you are buying speed, not greatness. And once he said the money buys 5 grams of coffee, the value case got pretty ugly. Convenience is always expensive when you break it down, honestly. The interesting part is that he is not anti-convenience, he is anti-self-deception. Like, if you want pods, fine, but do not pretend they are the same thing as fresh coffee. That would be like calling airport noodles cuisine. Harsh, but correct. What I loved most is how he keeps bringing it back to mindful consumption. Not less coffee necessarily, just more awareness about when and why you are drinking it. Because if caffeine is messing with your sleep, the morning ritual is secretly attacking tomorrow. That is such a clean way to think about it. Also, the health side was fascinating because he is not doing the usual caffeine panic thing. He is saying coffee may actually have benefits for cognition, longevity, gut health, and liver function. So the drink that people treat like a guilty sin may be more complicated than that. Which is very on brand for coffee, honestly, because it always refuses to be simple. It is never just caffeine, it is taste, chemistry, habit, economics, and self-delusion. And even the history part had that same shape, where coffee changes cities instead of just mornings. Weak beer being replaced by coffee is such a wild pivot for London. Imagine the collective productivity spike just because everybody got less drunk. Coffee houses becoming little business and politics engines makes perfect sense in hindsight. If a drink makes people alert, then suddenly the whole social structure gets sharper. And then we acted surprised that it became a cultural obsession. Humans love a stimulant with a story attached. What stays with me is how practical his worldview is underneath all the flavor talk. He is not telling people to become coffee snobs. He is telling them to stop wasting their own money and sleep, which is honestly a very elite form of kindness. And it ties back to the bigger trust idea, because he earns the right to talk about the harder stuff. First, he helps you buy a machine, then he tells you not to buy the wrong one, and then he talks about the future of coffee itself. That is the whole game, really. All right, that is where we leave the caffeine spiral for now. Next episode, we go even bigger into trust, audience, and why coffee becomes a worldview. And that is where the drink stops being the point and the identity starts showing up.